Chapter 3. The City of Nebuchadnezzar. Of the early Celtic inhabitants of the country 58 we know but little. Relics of the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Ages attest their presence. The hills are everywhere scarped with lines and entrenchments. It is extremely probable that York was the site of an ancient tribal settlement. Tradition says that the river banks, as far as the Humber, were protected by a chain of forts 2 miles apart. Canon James Rain. History to be properly understood demands a correct knowledge of the lands and areas involved, or otherwise it becomes misleading and largely valueless. The events pertaining to Babylon affect the world to this day, and if we fail to plant our feet firmly on its true soil they remain obscure, as though through a glass darkly. Much mystery surrounds, for example, the movements whereby the Israelites, besieged in their first capital, Hebron, Egyptian Thebes or Abaris, and, at the mercy of the Philistines, were permitted in the 8th year of King David's reign to remove themselves and all their belongings unmolested, to march through hostile territories and to seize, with little difficulty, the country of the Jebusites, with Jerusalem, over 400 miles distant. By Abram led originally south, they had, in times gone by, dominated the land of Mizraim for 500 years. After this long war they were at the complete mercy of their foes, the Philistines. Josephus calls it a great war. All Syria and Phoenicia, with many others besides, came against the Hebrews 59. 58 York is here being referred to. 59 Josephus, Antiquities, 7, 4, 1. The terms granted them were surprising for those harsh times. David was allowed to collect all those of his people willing to follow him and march away, wives and families too, retaining their personal belongings, to the city of Jebus, which fell like ripe fruit into their hands. Such tolerance is almost inexplicable, until we can divine the reason. It seems that the surrounding nations, Egyptians or Philistines, Syrians and Tyrians, agreed among themselves that the Israelites must go elsewhere, and to give them the opportunity, free of molestation, if they moved to a region far from their former habitation. 60 Moreover, to reach the land of the Jebusites they had to pass through Syria. Probably the subsequent close friendship between King Hiram of Tyre and David had something to do with this migration. In my identification of the true sites in question, these Israelites who for centuries had dominated the west and south from the vicinity of Avebury, in Wiltshire, where the great camp called Barbury Castle marks the original site of the citadel, Hebron, assembled there under David and trekked all the way to where Edinburgh now stands. They totaled about 250,000 persons according to Manetho, the Egyptian historian, though Josephus estimates a much higher figure, and they included 367,000 armed men. 61. The compiler of the Book of Chronicles subsequently endeavored to conceal the immensity of the Hebrew disaster, the text suggesting that the elders went to Hebron to anoint David as king, whereas he had already been their monarch for 7 years. I Chronicles 11, 1-3. Finally they set forth to acquire their new city, with the evident consent of their former foes. What route did they follow? My estimate of the period when David led his followers to Jerusalem is BC 1649, nearly 3,600 years ago, nothing very extraordinary considering the great age of civilization in Britain, the date, I may add, being based on astronomy. 62 We. 60 Josephus, against Apian, I, 4. 61 Josephus, Antiquities, 2, 2. 62 Britain, the key to world history. Have followed the Fosse Way, which then existed as an Atlantean highway, running not far north of Avebury, passing through Cirencester, a Philistine or Egyptian frontier city, leading on to Lincoln and York, and then northward again along the Ermine Street to their destination. If this were their route, they marched through Syria evidently with the consent of the Syrians. The passageway, avoiding the wilderness, as the scriptures describe the forest and rough lands, is always important in tracing prehistoric movements. An exodus such as this indicates that main thoroughfares must have existed, especially when the refugees were loaded up with their belongings. Higden and other antiquarian authorities have maintained that Ermine Street ran between Caithness and London. This supports its existence as early as the time of Abram, who set out from Ur of the Chaldees, South Orkney, and must have used a via through the immense Caledonian forest, so thick and impenetrable in many parts. As he went to Damascus before he moved on to the land of Canaan, his journey affords evidence of the existence of Ermine Street. Alternatively, reaching London, Damascus, whence he turned westward, his probable route was the road known as the Devil's Highway, a very old route also, and part of the Great West Road from London to Staines, via Bagshot Heath, thence to Silchester, Marlborough, near Avebury, and finally to Bath. 63. 63 The Roman road from London, which branching at Silchester communicated with the west of England and South Wales, is not referred to in the laws of Edward, though it was as important as any of the four ways. The road takes a direct course from London to cross the Thames at Staines, beyond which it bends slightly towards the south, and then turns due west, straight to Silchester, the Roman Caliva Atrebatum. From Silchester a road of which little trace remains led to the north. To the south a road went to Winchester, and on to Porchester and Chichester, to beyond Southampton, and to Old Sarum. To the southwest the portway led direct to Old Sarum, from which one road went to Dorchester and Exeter, and another westward, perhaps on to the Mendips. From Silchester to the west was a road to Speen, where it divided, one branch going to Bath and across the Severn to Caerleon and South Wales, and the other to Cirencester, Gloucester, Brecon, and to beyond Carmarthen. Crossing these roads was a road from Winchester by Marlborough to near Wanborough, which formed a part of Higden's Ermine Street from St. David's to Southampton. T. Codrington, Roman Roads in Britain, 1919. Roads sufficient for traffic, apart from tracks over hill and dale, of which numbers yet survive, speak eloquently of the means of transport, and there were numerous canals as well. In Plato's Critias it is said that the Atlanteans possessed enormous numbers of chariots for warfare, as did also the Philistines and others, which necessitated highways. The god Hermes, among his many services to man, was the deity of traffic and roads, and images of him were set up at crossroads by the Greeks and Britons. 64. This takes us back to the long trek of the Israelites from Mizpah to Jerusalem, Avebury to Edinburgh, for inferentially they had the consent of the Syrians to use their highway. It must have been part of the agreement that their migration allowed them the use of the highway to their new destination, and any such agreement would assuredly have included consent to their seizing the city of Jebus, which, according to the Greek traditions, was a city of the Encheleans, or Enchalds. According to their geography, it lay in Illyria, 65 the Greek Illyria being, as will be shown in due course, the British Siluria, where stands Edinburgh. The name Encheleans or Encheles can lead to an interesting disquisition as to these people, who were absorbed into Judea, with the name so close to the Scandinavian Angles, or English. At all events the arrangement was apparently satisfactory to all parties. Shortly afterwards we find that King Hiram of Tyre, at that time the wealthiest and most important monarch, proffered the most generous aid to both David and Solomon, and assisted largely to build the Temple of Solomon, a temple dedicated to Molech or Melech, Melk, king, the Tyrian Melkarth, the god, not hero, Hercules, otherwise Poseidon, the powerful lord. That this was so was indicated by its molten sea, which Josiah destroyed, and other Phoenician symbols. Hiram was probably the Hiram, or Hermes of that period in the south, and was thus able to save the Israelites and become the patron and friend of David and Solomon. 64 The riddle of prehistoric Britain. 65 Herodotus, History, I, 73. This tends to simplify the situation, but in no wise fits in with the accepted sites in the present Palestine, where Hebron is sited a few miles from the current Jerusalem and the powerful Philistines are accorded a tiny stretch of territory, separated from Egypt by the desert of Sinai. Such geography is false to British history. The foregoing explains the itinerary of the Judaeans to Jerusalem, Edinburgh, but what of Babylon? Babylon, at that period, had not achieved its later power. It was Chaldean, or Syrian, because its founder, Nimrod, had descended from the mountains of Chaldea to the plain which they called Shinar. 66 Josephus describes Nimrod as a bold man and of great strength of hand, 67 exemplified in Genesis 10:9, as the mighty hunter before the Lord. This description is noteworthy because the fabulous great hero of prehistoric Greece was Orion, also the great and mighty hunter who was subsequently placed among the constellations. Corey in his well-known work states that Orion was the founder of Babylon and its first king. 68 Nimrod and Orion were apparently one and the same. It may be permissible to draw the reader's attention to the curious resemblance between the ancient and long prehistoric hero Fingal, or Finmakal, White Gale and Orion. Fingal, illustrious warrior, conqueror, and hunter, able in one stride to reach Aran Island from Mole, resembles Orion, the mythical hunter of great size and strength, who was placed by Hermes among the constellations, where Sirius nearby is described by Homer as the dog of Orion, as Ben Cruachan was the dog of Fingal. 69. This comparative myth suggests that Nimrod, one of the earliest of the race of Titans, or sons of Adam, a giant among giants, reputed always as a great hunter, led his followers from the mountains of Chaldea or Scotland to the plain of Shinar, and was later immortalized by transfer to the celestial heavens in the ancient. 66 Josephus, Antiquities, I. 4, 1. 67 Josephus, Antiquities, I. 4, 1. 68 J. P. Corey, Ancient Fragments, 12. 69 The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain. On the Goldsby Stone, an ancient Chaldean zodiac, the figure of Orion is given. Sirius was the watchdog of Orion, the Watcher. Zodiac. This is in accord with classic references to the earliest civilization attributed to the Hyperboreans, or, in other words, to the Chaldeans or Ethiopians, all one and the same. It accords also with the great antiquity of Babylon, which was traditionally built by giants. Moreover, it indicates that the founders of Babylon were prehistoric Gaels from the north. Also it fits in with the contention that the Gaelic Senans of Yorkshire and Lincoln were descendants of the Sena in the plain of Shinar. Whereby we return to the vicissitudes of Babylon, which I claim was the original city of York, formerly Erech and later Stratos Tower, then Caesarea, and finally Eboracum or Jorvik. According to the vestiges of Berosus' History of the Chaldeans, he himself being one, Nabopolassar sent his son against the Egyptians, Wessex and Wales, Coel Syria, the Central Plain, and Phoenicia, Dorset, and died while Nebuchadnezzar was absent on this campaign, in which he was victorious. He hastened to return as soon as possible to Babylon and found that the principal men of the Chaldeans had preserved his throne for him. He adorned the temple of Bel and other temples with the spoils he had captured in the war. Berosus continues. He also rebuilt the older city and added another suburb to it on the outside, across the river, and so far restored Babylon that none who should besiege it afterwards should have it in their power to divert the river so as to facilitate entrance to it, and this he did by building 3 walls about the inner city and 3 about the outer 70. It is one of the characteristic features of Babylon that the main river flowing through the city is emphasized unusually. It lay on a branch of the river Euphrates, or Perath, which is claimed earlier related to what is now the North Sea but was originally an extension of the Rhine, whose twisted and contorted mouths today indicate great geological changes in that region, as early history reveals. Nebuchadnezzar, as Berosus says, foresaw the possibility of diverting the stream called Gozan, Uz, which very act Cyrus did later accomplish, with the aid of treachery from within. 70 Josephus, against Apian, I. 19. The fluvial conditions of York are so similar in all comparable respects to those of Babylon that they might be considered together. The river which flowed in from the Euphrates and washed the city is like the Humber and the river Ouse which bisects York. Beyond the west bank of the river of Babylon we learn of the existence of a large lake or mere, which Semiramis was reputed to have begun to lay out from a marshy tract, but according to Herodotus, Queen Nitocris, the mother of Belshazzar, caused it to be made occupying an area of about 40 square miles. It was originally a marsh or morass and became such again after the capture of Babylon by Cyrus. 71 The Vale of York was correspondingly very marshy to the west and south, an area very flat with several rivers running into it, and uniting with the Ouse. This tract was formerly known as the Levels, and was half swamp, half unenclosed moorland. 72 It was in fact part of the fenlands descending into Lincoln and beyond. We are told that at Babylon a canal led from the river to the lake, which could have been near York where the river wharf flows into the Ouse a little below the city. All this region is naturally flat and marshy, and the Humber estuary was formerly longer and wider than today's, it being now much silted up, and it answers to the eastern Hamath area, Great Hamath, otherwise the great mouth of the river. There were two separate Hamaths, one relating to the mouth of the Bristol Avon, and the other to the Humber. 73 When Cyrus encamped before Babylon, whose inhabitants had made every preparation for a long siege, and regarded their city as impregnable, he realized the impossibility of taking it by storm and decided to turn the course of the river into the lake or swamp. What he did was to dam the river near where it entered and left the city, then cut trenches off the river to a huge trench he caused to be dug along the circumvallation of the city and thus drew off the surplus waters. When all was prepared he sent troops to break down the dam or gates of the canal which released the surplus waters from 71 Rev. William Lawson, Scripture Gazetteer, I, p. 271. 72 Morris, East Riding of Yorkshire, p. 10. 73 Britain, The Key to World History, pp 85-9, 107-8, 115. The river into the lake, all being done under cover of darkness when the Babylonians were holding a religious revel and neglecting the guard. The river was then drained sufficiently to enable his soldiers to enter through the heavy brass gates, which in at least two places had been carelessly or deliberately left unlocked. These gates or locks were, it appears, built in tunnels which penetrated the surrounding walls, but there is reason to believe betrayal was at work over this easy conquest, for Cyrus risked losing the flower of his army had his ruse been detected. No ancient city was ever more eulogized or its grandeur and the height of its walls. Its glory was essentially owed to King Nebuchadnezzar and his father Nabopolassar, who defeated the surrounding nations, and, after the downfall of Nineveh, made it the world's capital, a center of great trade, enterprise, and wealth. Classic writers describe a city forming an immense square, traversed by 25 streets intersecting one another, which resulted in numerous smaller squares, not unlike a modern American city, and, it might be averred, like the indications of the lost city's crisscross streets traceable in Caithness. 74 The principal thoroughfares terminated in a series of brass gates of prodigious strength and thickness, over which towered the immense walls, and outside the walls was a deep moat or ditch except where the river flowed. The estimated height of the original walls varies greatly. Herodotus made them 337 feet high and 84 feet wide, Ctesias and Orosius, 300 feet, and Diodorus 75 feet. After Darius, Hystaspes lowered them, some accounts say to 50 feet. Diodorus says also that 6 chariots could ride abreast on their summit, though Herodotus states only one, but he includes houses on either side. Their extent also differs from a circumference of from 40 to 60 miles, but Quintus Curtius, in his History of Alexander, said that only 90 stadia, about 11 miles, were occupied with buildings in rows and that a great space stood apart and grew produce etc. 74 See Infra, pp 111-4. Nebuchadnezzar's outstanding works were the Temple or Tower of Bel and the New Palace. The latter was erected by him on the west of the river. Cyrus and, later, Alexander, occupied this palace, and there the great Macedonian died of pneumonia contracted from a chill. The famous hanging gardens were laid out in the park of this palace, consisting of artificial mounds with a succession of terraces with a variety of trees which were planted to please his queen Amytis, a Median princess, who came from a mountainous country, thus contrasting with the flat plain where Babylon stood. On the east of the river, exactly opposite, we are told, stood the old palace, in the original city, adjoining which Nebuchadnezzar built a bridge which here crossed the river to the new palace and city, so that at either end of it was one or other of the palaces surrounded with immense walls. Is it a coincidence that the site of these two palaces is exactly duplicated at York, by the Old Bailey on the west of the Ouse, whose origin is unknown to antiquarians, and the original palace facing it? In ancient deeds the former is referred to as Vetus Balium, or Old Bailey, signifying a place of security. Sheehan and Whelan, in their work on York, describe it nearly a century ago as ornamented with a small plantation of trees, and from its summit is a fine view of York. 75 The general view of historians, they state, is that there was a castle on the summit of this artificial tumulus in the time of the Saxons and that of William the Conqueror, to serve as the chief garrison in that part of the city, not lying on the same side as the other castle. 76. Naturally, historians and others have taken a very different angle to that presented here. They would no more have associated the Old Bailey with Nebuchadnezzar's new palace than with Timbuktu. Yet we, pursuing a different clue, have here an artificial tumulus, a mound ornamented with trees, indeed a queer coincidence were it not the site of the Hanging Gardens, comparing exactly, it might be said, in situation, with the original palace across the river which the king of Babylon built for his queen. 75 J. J. Sheehan and T. Whelan, History and Topography of the City of York, I. p. 337. 76 Ibid. As regards the other castle on the east of the Ouse, Sheehan and Whelan mention that it was believed by Drake, the earlier historian of York, to have been erected by the conqueror on the site of an earlier fortress. It was entirely surrounded by a deep moat, accessible only by two drawbridges. The principal gate was formerly on the east side, near the castle mills, and a small archway under the walls of the gate marked the spot where the ancient drawbridge was erected. In Leland's time, Henry VIII, it was in a ruinous state. He writes, "There be 5 ruinous towers in it." 77. One further point by these two writers may be mentioned. Within the walls of the castle, they say, stands the beautiful ruin called Clifford's Tower. It stands on a lofty mound of earth which, at some remote period, has been thrown up by immense labor. This tumulus and ruin exactly correspond with Old Bailey Hill on the opposite side of the river. Drake thinks that a tower stood on the mound during the Roman residence. There is something about Clifford's Tower possibly of great interest to which I will revert a little later. Let us first examine the evidence about the famous Tower of Babel. In proximity to the original old palace of Nebuchadnezzar stood the Temple of Bel, erected before his time, but which he very nearly, if not completely, rebuilt, increased and heightened, as well as enriched, early in his reign. This immense edifice captivated the imagination of the ancients. Constructed of bricks and slime, tar, it rose from the ground in 8 portions or floors, like one tower superimposed on another. Ascent to its summit was by outside stairs, a spiral staircase with a resting place provided with seats at each flight. In the various compartments or stories were rooms with arched roofs, supported by pillars, which were related to the worship of the god. The topmost edifice was most sacred, expressly dedicated to the god Bel, furnished with a couch and table both of solid gold, but having no statue of the god, who was believed to. 77 Ibid, p. 338. As in Babylon, both places faced one another across the river with a connecting bridge. Occupy it at his pleasure. The wealth of this temple in statues, censers, cups, and other sacred vessels, all of solid gold and massive size, was almost fabulous. One golden image alone, 40 feet in height, weighed 1,000 Babylonian talents. According to Rollin, the French historian, when Xerxes plundered the temple of its immense wealth, its value was over 21 million sterling. 78. According to Diodorus, the upper part was an observatory, the Chaldeans being most famed beyond all others for their skills in astronomy. When Alexander the Great took Babylon, Callisthenes, the philosopher, discovered that they had recorded astronomical observations going back 1,903 years from that time. The construction of this vast edifice had 2 definite purposes. One was astronomical, especially to watch Helios, Sirius. the other as a place of refuge in the event of another flood. Helios, otherwise Bel or Belin, was the Hyperborean Apollo, traditionally born in Delos, and was of the most vital importance in the eyes of the classic world as the true habitation of the deity himself. 79 Sirius, the star of Hermes, the god of the astronomers, was always regarded with anxiety as the harbinger of drought, pestilence, wars, and celestial visitations, comets and meteors. The Hyperboreans or Chaldeans, the same, related Sirius to the cause of the great catastrophe and deified it as Apollo. How would this, it may reasonably be asked, have affected the religion and astronomy of the ancients dwelling in the Persian Gulf, where no such catastrophe ever occurred, or its traces could be distinguished? In Britain it was an entirely different matter. The great catastrophe destroyed Ur of the Chaldees, and it would seem that naturally Babylon, with Borsippa the center of Chaldean influence after Ur, would succeed as the seat of the Chaldean hierarch. This would explain the king's claim to be the Chaldean Hermes, the supporter of the god Apollo. He reconstructed the Temple of Bel, based on 78 Lawson, Scripture Gazetteer, I. p. 264. 79 Revered in Greek mythology. The riddle of prehistoric Britain. Astronomy, some 110 years after that malign event, he then being regarded, it would appear, as the living Hermes, messenger of the gods, chief of the Magi, in which capacity set up his famous image of Bel in the plain of Dura. It implied his image as a god-king. 80. That the temple was in essence astronomical, whereby from its summit the star Sirius was observed closely in all his phases and quadratures, was fully recognized. Sirius, as Bel or Belin, was carefully watched at Stonehenge and elsewhere in Britain, and when we consider the tradition, that the tower was first erected after the flood in case God should be minded to destroy the world again, the basic principle resembles the Great Pyramid, raised, despite all the learned claims to the contrary, for the like purpose, although of totally different design, namely to preserve the sacred caste of druids or priests in the event of another flood. The wise men of old, and Nebo was the god of wisdom, magi, astronomers, and rulers, thus endeavored to arrange for their self-preservation in this high tower in the event of another like catastrophe, for the water would have to mount very high to drown them, whereby they anxiously scanned the skies and watched Sirius. Owing to the wisdom of these ancient Chaldean astronomers, we have the prehistoric sacred engraved zodiacal stones with their portentous message in Caledonia, including especially the Golpsy stone, which contains in celestial symbols the information of when, how, and where the flood occurred in the time of Noah. Appendix B. The height of this Tower of Bel, according to Strabo and Dionysius, was one stadium, usually taken as 600 feet, the Olympiad measurement of the Greeks, but possibly 631 feet. No wonder this monster tower captivated the imagination of the ancient world, being at least twice the height of Nelson's Column in London, or about that of the Woolwich Building in New York, but considerably less than the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which reaches to 906 feet, and has an additional chamber for astronomical study. 80 W. Smith, Bible Dictionary, pp. 599, 891. Nebo/Nebu, Hermes, Chad/Cad, Kaddish, Holy, Nezkar/Nazar, Prophet. Defying Jehovah as it did in the eyes of certain Jewish prophets, extraordinary and phenomenal as it would be in the eyes of most, it was a practical undertaking for its intended purpose. The ownership of Bel or Apollo, and the importance attached to the god astronomically, offers evidence of considerable importance, for his worship was established in the north, as he was the Hyperborean deity in Excelsis, as he was also that of the Chaldeans, otherwise Caledonians, and of the Hellenes, who dwelt in northern Britain and Ireland, the true Hellas, or Hades. Apollo had no connection whatsoever with the regions of the Orient, and provided one of the great truths about the true trend of antiquity. Consider Babylon also in conjunction with the evidence of Strato's Tower, situated on its tidal river, which negates any connection with countries washed by the present Persian Gulf. 81 When we consider also the suburb on the other bank of the river, or the two castles facing one another, one on a mound of trees and shrubs, recalling the hanging gardens, and of the swamp and meres to the southwest of Babylon. These cannot be dismissed as coincidences. Nor should we overlook the proximity of York to Lincoln, the one being originally Babylon, the other Antioch. Finally, place names, as Erech or York, Borsippa and Eboracum, with the river Gozan answering to the Uz, all complete the identification of Babylon, otherwise Erech, later Stratos Tower, with Caesarea. There are also other traces to be produced. 81 Ed note, tides rise to 5 feet in the Persian Gulf, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and up to 25 feet in the Humber Estuary, according to the UK Environment Agency. Warning, empty page. Chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar and the Jews. Babylon's growing power under Nebuchadnezzar alarmed Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, who made war on him, in which he was heavily defeated, and his ally Josiah, king of Judah, slain in battle. As a result, Judah became a dependency of Babylon and its warlike monarch. One after the other, the succeeding kings of Judah were treated as mere ciphers and slain or deposed. Jehoiakim rebelled and was taken in chains to Babylon, along with some of the sacred golden vessels from the Temple of Solomon, which were deposited in the Temple of Bel. 3 months later, his successor, Jehoiachin, was also taken, together with his mother and family, to Babylon, with the remaining goodly vessels from the temple, totaling 5,400 in all, which were again deposited with Bel. In Jehoiachin's place followed Zedekiah, who lasted 11 years until he also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear before God. Moreover, all the chiefs of the priests, and the people, transgressed very much after all the abomination of the heathen, and polluted the house of the Lord, which he had hallowed in Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 36, 13-4. This seems a significant and curious statement from a Mosaic source, nor does it stand alone. Jeremiah makes much the same claim. Does it mean that they had already deserted the reforms of Josiah and relapsed into their previous paganism? Was Nebuchadnezzar himself supporting the Mosaic faith? There are reasons to suppose this was the case. Evidently the king of Babylon decided to end the Judean kingdom. He burnt down the Temple of Solomon, broke down the city wall, destroyed the palaces, and took away the remaining treasures. He finally removed the remaining inhabitants where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. 36:20. The tribulations of the people of Jerusalem were severe. They suffered from dire famine and the city was burned over their heads. Nebuchadnezzar's treatment of Zedekiah was cruel and savage even for those harsh times. Defeated. It seems to have been related to religious beliefs, so-called, captured in the plains of Jericho, which was actually the Hebrew name for Erech or Babylon. He was brought before the Babylonian king at Riblah, possibly Ripley, an ancient name for Harrogate. Nebuchadnezzar caused Zedekiah's sons to be slain before his very eyes and then carried him off in chains to Babylon, where he was no more heard of. 2 Kings 25, 5-7. What lay behind the policy of Nebuchadnezzar is a mystery. It was not loot he wanted, for the temple treasures were merely stored in the Temple of Bel. It was not fear of any alliance within Egypt because Necho had been badly which so largely directed state policy. This period in question is outstanding in matters of religion, which were in effect mainly political, but affecting the Jews. On the one hand was Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean Hermes, claiming to be a living deity with his god Apollo, and on the other, across the narrow waters of the Euphrates, was the advance of the militant gospel of Zoroaster, consuming fire, actually the Mosaic or Jehovah faith. This Mosaic or Zoroastrian cultus, supported by the Medes and Persians, and others, really based on the use of armaments, otherwise firearms, on an extensive scale, had already triumphed in Mysia, Phrygia, Assyria, and elsewhere in the northeast of the continent. The Medes and Persians were only biding their opportunity to capture Babylon. To realize the atmosphere which preceded Nebuchadnezzar's reign, a short summary of how the Moses cult was introduced to the Judeans by subterfuge is given from my previous work. Point 82. 1. The great catastrophe or flood had taken place in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, less than 125 years before the period under consideration. Applying its effects, as already seen, its action paralyzed the west of Britain far more than the east, which escaped comparatively free. Jerusalem, on the site of the present Edinburgh, was badly shaken and damaged by earthquake and tidal wave. Babylon escaped anything serious. The period in question had coincided with Moses and the plagues of Egypt. Moses, calling himself Rabshakeh, brought the 82 Britain, the key to world history. Jehovah, or JHVH, or IAO, were all variations of the Mosaic cult. IAO was the secret name of Yahovah. Cult of Zoroaster to the west with enormous armaments, and his new deity Jehovah, or consuming fire. An event in the 18th year of Josiah proved that the Judeans had hitherto never heard of Moses and his laws. The circumstances indicated that a secret concord between the priesthood had operated to establish the Mosaic faith, for their own purposes. Josiah, greatly influenced by the threats, overthrew the former forms of worship and proclaimed the Mosaic deity Jehovah. The chief priest Hilkiah, and Shaphan, the scribe, in the 18th year of Josiah, introduced this revolutionary new faith only 35 years before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. For some 18 years previously, numbers of leading Jews had been taken as prisoners to Babylon and were given much freedom. Subsequent events indicate that a powerful Jewish underground movement existed to betray Babylon to the Medes and Persians under Cyrus. 83. In the circumstances of his age, Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean hierarch, would be expected to regard as dangerous foes those with leanings towards the Mosaic faith, or Zoroastrianism, which was becoming more menacing, not only in its religious claims, but in armaments. The Chaldean priests were bitter enemies of this new creed, but Nebuchadnezzar became swayed by motives difficult to account for except that he became mentally unbalanced. Bible history comes to us through Mosaic spectacles, but it brought on the Jews the hatred of civilized nations by their intolerant claims and led to their ultimate downfall as an independent people. Nebuchadnezzar in his treatment of the Judeans did not dethrone their kings or destroy their city through any of the usual motives of a conqueror. He tolerated their kings until they became hostile and adverse towards him. Even their sacred treasures he seized were not taken for their intrinsic value, for he only stored them in his great temple of Bel, and he gave them 15 years to adjust their policy to his before he destroyed Jerusalem and overthrew Solomon's temple. 83 Ibid. We can obtain the clue to his outlook from 2 or 3 different directions. The motives which actuate the policy of rulers are always of concern, and in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, who regarded himself as the living representative of Bel, it would naturally have caused him to show strong hostility toward the Mosaic creed. He was very different to Cyrus, who used religion as a political weapon to further his own aims. Jessel says, in those portions of the Bible which give an account of events after Solomon, we find occasional references to Moses, his laws, statutes, and commandments, interpolations of the scribes to pave the way for the astounding discovery made in the reign of Josiah. 84 Everything should point to Nebuchadnezzar's hostility to the Mosaic cult, which was that forced upon the world subsequently by the Medes and Persians. What occurred, as reported in 2 Kings 22, I repeat, was that the high priest Hilkiah, in the 18th year of Josiah, only 16 years before Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, discovered a scroll, mysteriously hidden somewhere in the temple, which was read by Shaphan, a scribe to the king who, directly he heard the threats conveyed in this portion of the law of Moses, was greatly disturbed, rent his clothes, and blamed his forefathers for not having hearkened unto the words of this book. 2 Kings 22:13. It is evident that until this particular moment neither the king nor his forefathers, nor the Judeans, had ever heard of Moses or his laws. All the previous kings had lived and died in supreme ignorance of such a prophet. Dr. A. Kehonan, in the Religion of Israel, citing Deuteronomy 26 and 28, suggests that the passages read to Josiah related to the first fruits for the Lord, i.e., the priesthood, and tithes to the Levites, the fighting caste, with savage penalties of destruction from heaven, pestilence, and defeats, to those who disobeyed these precepts. They probably also scared the king in regard to idols and graven images, for which sin it was threatened that the Lord God is a consuming fire, and would destroy and scatter them among the nations. Deuteronomy 4, 24-8. 84 E. Jessel, The Unknown History of the Jews. The result of this explosive ultimatum caused Josiah to call the elders to the temple, where he read the damning passages in question and made a public vow to keep these commandments. He brought out all the temple vessels made for Baal and the grove, and other pagan treasures, and burnt them. He defiled Tophet in the valley of Hinnom, so that no man might sacrifice his children by passing them through the fire to Molech, took away the horses of the sun, and its chariot, in Solomon's temple, and burnt them, and put down the idolatrous priests who served Molech. 2 Kings 23, 1-4. It is plain that hitherto the Judaeans had worshipped Molech, otherwise Melkarth, the god of Tyre as also of Solomon, to whose activities were attributed earthquakes and pestilences. The molten sea in Solomon's temple, with its chariot and horses, conveying a statue of the god, actually Poseidon, supported by brazen bulls below holding up the molten sea, reveal the ancestral form of pagan worship as late as Josiah's day. It reveals the fraud imposed on the subsequent Jews of pretending an earlier Moses in the history of Israel than his true period, which was only a little prior to that now being explained. How far Jeremiah, so active in the subsequent reign of Zedekiah, may be accepted as authentic apart from doctrine, depends on the biblical scribes and revisers. Taking his fulminations on their merits, in the 10th year of Zedekiah, when Jerusalem was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar, it seems that Josiah's reforms had been largely thrown aside. Jeremiah prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would take the city because the nation had done evil, their kings and princes had provoked the Lord to anger, including also their priests and prophets. They built the high places of Baal which are in the valley of the son of Hinnom to cause the sons and daughters to pass through the fire unto Molech, which I commanded them not. Jeremiah 32, 35. He also accused them of offering incense unto Baal. 11, 17, they had walked after the imagination of their own heart, and after Baalim, which their fathers taught them. 9, 14, it would seem that Jeremiah accused them of relapsing to their old Hebrew deities despite Josiah's conversion. Later scribes, having to adduce a reason for Josiah's desertion, fell back on the shortcomings of Manasseh, Josiah's predecessor, as this passage indicates. Notwithstanding Josiah's reforms, the Lord turned not from the fierceness of his great wrath, whereby his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations that Manasseh had provoked him withal. 2 Kings 23, 26, in view of the conversion of Josiah it would seem to many a trivial excuse. It appears, however, strangely enough from many happenings, that Nebuchadnezzar's anger was kindled against the Judaeans not because they had adopted the Mosaic doctrine but because they were relapsing to their former gods and idols. This is seen in his contacts with Ezekiel. His attitude towards Jeremiah was also very friendly. The prophet, accused by the princes and judges of falling away to the Chaldeans, was thrown into a dark dungeon and nearly starved to death, but immediately the city was seized he was at once released by order of the king of Babylon, and sent for safety to Gedaliah, and made governor of Mizpah by Nebuchadnezzar. When Gedaliah was assassinated by Ishmael, Jeremiah was led, with the daughters of Zedekiah, to the palace of the king of Egypt. 85. A clear indication of Nebuchadnezzar's apparent attitude to the Mosaic cult would appear to be related to the setting up of his god as a golden image in the plain of Dura, as a test of faith, but from later events it is in doubt. The book of Daniel describes this prodigious idol as 60 cubits, almost 30 meters, in height and 6 cubits, almost 3 meters, in breadth. To its dedication he 85 Mizpah, Avabari, lay near Rabbath Ammon, Bath. Johanan intercepted Ishmael's intention to take Jeremiah to Rabbath, but conducted him, together with the 2 daughters of the king, to the border of Egypt, the Severn estuary, and to Pharaoh Necho's palace at Tahpanhes, Landafon Taf. From the passage crossing of the Severn they were taken to Tahpanhes, where from remote times there stood a castle. The princesses were adopted by Pharaoh and, in accordance with ancient custom, were termed daughters of Pharaoh. Jeremiah concealed some great stones near the royal palace, and here for a time he probably secreted the Leah-Phael or coronation stone, which he brought away from Jerusalem. Jeremiah 42:17, 43:1-10. We know that at this time he was attended by his faithful adherent Baruch, 43:3. Irish traditions claim that Jeremiah sailed to Ireland, taking the two daughters of Pharaoh with him, also the Leah-Phael, accompanied by Baruch. One of the princesses, Tephne, married Hiramon, a prince of the Tuatha De Danann, at Tara. Jeremiah died in Ireland and was buried there. Al Totten, Our Race and Its Destiny, Resonance BW. The coronation stone reached Scotland from Ireland. Commanded the presence of the elite of the nation, all the princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, councillors, and sheriffs, proof of a highly civilized government, with others of all tongues. He had a full band of musicians and a herald, who cried out to all nations and languages to fall down and worship the image when the musicians played the chord. Daniel 3:4-5. Any who refused would be condemned to a ready-prepared fiery furnace. It is open to question how the miracle was performed whereby Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were thrown into the furnace yet remained unscathed and were seen walking unharmed in the midst of the fire, and with a fourth, like the Son of God accompanying them, for the Jews had never heard then of the Son of God. 3:25. It needs considerable faith to accept this story at its face value, like that of Daniel in the lion's den. Its sequel, that Nebuchadnezzar was converted by the miracle to revere the Jewish deity, is equally curious. At this time, Daniel stood very high in the opinion of the Babylonian king, as we shall see later. Where was the plain of Dura, specially selected for this test of faith? In view of the great assemblage of notabilities, it would not, presumably, have been very far from Babylon itself, and may thus present a clue to its site. Less than 20 miles east of York stands the ancient town of Great Driffield, its earlier name traditionally having been Dara Field, which compares with Dura Plain. Outside the town itself stands a large prehistoric artificial mound named Moot Hill, the place of assembly in ancient days. If Dara Field marks the original site of the plain of Dura where the great golden image was set up, here we may conclude was the probable scene of that extraordinary gathering. Moot Hill was in ancient times a centre from whence laws and royal commands were issued. About 12 miles beyond is the site called Old Dor, which, as Dor, is mentioned in connection with Strato's Tower, once largely inhabited. The question arises, was Nebuchadnezzar on that occasion or even before converted into a believer in the God of Moses and Daniel, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Was it a prearranged spectacular conversion? Was Daniel, prophet and magician, behind it? Daniel by the river Uz. We have another remarkable witness in this king's attitude to Ezekiel, whose story commences in the 5th year of Zedekiah, and curiously Ezekiel says it was the 30th year of the captivity, although it was only the 17th year of Nebuchadnezzar's domination. The 30th year was the 18th of Josiah, the very year when that king listened to the plot which caused the Moses cult to be instituted. May it suggest that Ezekiel actually dated the downfall and captivity of his people from that time as punishment for their change of faith? We should examine the evidence closely. He was among the captives by the river of Chebar, Ezekiel 1:1, otherwise of Eber or York. Of a sudden, an extraordinary apparition appeared from the sky to the north. Mystifying words are used in his story, and unless he is describing some form of aircraft containing living beings, one of whom was of major importance, it is altogether unintelligible. The craft landed near him, accompanied by a great noise like thunder, flashing lights, a suggestion of some sort of engine, and a piston rod, described in these words. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like coals of fire and like the appearance of lamps, it went up and down among the living creatures, and the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. And the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. 1:13-4. Some frightful rings were full of eyes. Complete analysis of this confused medley of words may defy us, but we may visualize flashing lights and something which automatically moved up and down like the piston rods of an engine, or a reactor ed. It suggests machinery if it suggests nothing else. The wings are not so difficult to compute. The machine had 4 wings all alike, joined to one another in 2 tiers, went straight forward and turned not. This seems to imply a biplane. The reference to wheels is more involved. As he looked he beheld one wheel upon the earth, which may suggest that the machine was landing. 1:15. The 4 wheels, like a wheel within a wheel, turned not when they went, and the rings full of eyes round about them, and whithersoever they went the wings were lifted up against them. The spirit of the living creature was within the wheels. 1:16-20. I can only suggest that this is a reference to propellers. It arrived like a whirlwind, out of the north, a great cloud, fire, and brightness. 1:4. All these allusions in a strange way appear to indicate some form of aircraft, with 2 pairs of wings, propellers, and an engine. The references to the crew are equally strange. The hands of a man appear under their wings. Then we are told there were 4 other living creatures inside the strange device. One was a man, but all had 4 wings, and under their feet were straight feet which sparkled like burnished brass. Again, the 4 had the face of a man, a lion on the right, a face of an ox on the left. They also had the face of an eagle. 1:10. This sounds so fantastic that one would attribute the whole to a vision or dream, unless it were that the prophet, in the confusion caused by this mysterious descent, might have confused painted designs on the fuselage in which the crew were seated. However, whatever these mystic allusions might have signified, we are told that upon a throne above these 4 was the likeness, appearance, of a man, surrounded by a brightness about him. He spoke, and Ezekiel fell upon his face. 1:28. The mystery is dispelled. The voice of the man is decisive enough. Son of man, he said, stand upon thy feet. He then issued his commands. I send thee to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that hath rebelled against me. They and their forefathers have transgressed against me, even unto this very day. Thou shalt say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, and they shall know there hath been a prophet among them, and thou shalt speak my words unto them. But thou, son of man, be not thou rebellious like that rebellious house. Open thy mouth and eat what I give thee. Ezekiel 2:1-8. My italics here and in immediately following quotes. Ezekiel goes on to say that a hand passed him a roll of a book, written inside and out. He was commanded again to eat it. Son of man, cause thy belly to eat and fill thy bowels with this roll I give thee. He ate it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. Then this mysterious person gave him final commands. Go, get thee unto the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. But the house of Israel will not hearken unto thee, for they will not hearken unto me, for all the house of Israel are impudent and hard-hearted. And go, get thee to them of the captivity, unto the children of thy people, and speak unto them, and tell them, Thus saith the Lord God, whether they will hear, or whether they will forbear. 3:4-11. The sense of the instruction was that as the ruling house of Israel, King Zedekiah would not heed the speaker, nay, was even impudent, as likewise the nation, and accordingly the prophet was to go to Jerusalem and prophesy to the people themselves and warn them on the lines of the roll of paper he had managed somehow to consume. Finally the Spirit took him up where he heard also the noise of the wings, and the noise of the wheels, and the noise of a great rushing, and was put down beside those of the captivity at Tel Abib, that dwelt by the river of Chebar, where he sat astonished among them for 7 days. Finally he received a message from the Lord, which said, Son of man, I have made thee the watchman of the house of Israel, therefore hear the word of my mouth and give them warning from me. 3:12-7. This constitutes the first part of Ezekiel's astonishing narrative, and before we examine it critically it is necessary to come to the sequel 13 months later. We have no evidence whether Ezekiel actually visited Jerusalem and prophesied as this mysterious person or spirit commanded, perhaps with pride, and so subsequent chapters recount what he was to tell or did tell the rebellious Israelites. 13 months later, on the 5th day of the 6th month in the 6th year, about 1 year before Zedekiah openly rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by God, Ezekiel sat in his house with the elders of Judah, when the Spirit or Lord God reappeared in the machine, and the hand of the Lord God fell there upon me. The Spirit put forth the form of a hand and lifted him up between heaven and earth, and eventually set him down beside the temple in Jerusalem. Within the vicinity of the court of the temple a secret door was indicated, and he was ordered to enter and see the wicked abominations. Ezekiel obeyed and mentions every form of creeping things and abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel in a concealed chamber. Gathered there were many men, including Jazaniah, the son of Shaphan, each with a censer in his hand and a thick cloud of incense, but what they were doing is left to the imagination. The same being showed him with abhorrence women by the north gate of the temple weeping for Tammuz. Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Demanded this being. Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. He led Ezekiel into the inner court of the temple, where about 25 men had their backs towards the altar and their faces towards the east, worshipping the sun. Again the mystery man spoke of abominations and said they had returned to provoke me to anger, and, lo, they put the branch, finger, to their nose. Therefore will I deal in fury. 8, 9-18. The being or spirit thereupon called for several guards, each with a destroying weapon. 6 responded, bringing slaughter weapons. 9, 1-2. There also appeared one other clothed in linen with an inkhorn by his side, who was ordered by the being to go through the city and set a mark on the foreheads of men who supported the abominations. The 6 were to follow and slay all, whether young or old, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. The massacre started with the ancient men which were before the house. 9, 6. The ancient men, the sun worshippers, were slain. Ezekiel, perceiving where all this led, fell on his face before the being and cried, Ah, Lord God, wilt thou destroy all the residue of Israel in thy pouring out of thy fury upon Jerusalem? The reply was adamant, Mine I shall not spare, neither will I have pity. 9, 8-10. The only interpretation is that the being regarded himself as Lord God. The machine which had brought them was sitting before the threshold of the temple. The being had ordered the man in linen to go in between the wheels, even under the cherubim, and fill thine hand with coals of fire from between the cherubim and scatter them over the city. 10, 2. The man obeyed, and the being and Ezekiel got back into the machine, which prepared to ascend. A cloud filled the inner court as the machine rose into the air and stood over the temple, with more cloud and the sound of wings. The man in linen stood beside the wheels, and one cherub stretched forth his hand and gave fire to him. They passed above the temple towards the door of the east gate, where stood 25 men, including Jazaniah, the son of Uzzah, and Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, princes of the people. 11, 1. The being told Ezekiel, These are the men that devise mischief, and give wicked counsel in this city. Therefore against them, prophesy, O son of man. 11, 2-4. Ezekiel obeyed, and as he prophesied their ill fate, it came to pass, when I prophesied, that Pelatiah, the son of Benaiah, died. Then fell I down upon my face. 11, 13. The end of the vision was that the Spirit brought him back to the captivity in Chaldea, where he remained. 11, 24-5, and cried with a loud voice, and said, Ah, Lord God! Wilt thou make a full end of the remnant of Israel? Such then is the dramatic account contained in these earlier chapters of Ezekiel, from which I have extracted the salient points. Regarding the last incident, the death of Pelatiah, cause and effect are obviously linked up with the coals of fire which the man in linen was ordered to scatter over the city. As Ezekiel was called upon to prophesy, the explosive was released and Pelatiah was killed instantly. Hence the prophet's agony of mind. Are we to regard all the foregoing as a mere vision or hallucination on the part of one of the major prophets who, according to his story, was taken in this machine with wings, whirring wheels suggestive of propellers, with the crew wearing wings or parachutes, flown from the river of Chebar to Jerusalem, was again re-embarked, after the man in linen, brought for a specific purpose, was on board, passed over the temple, and when Ezekiel was abruptly told to prophesy, some explosive substance was released, with the result that a prince of Israel whom he identified was killed outright. Can we pass this by, with all its intricate detail, such as the marking of foreheads and the massacre in cold blood, as without any significance or even reality? Surely not. It rings true in view of our knowledge of military planes of today. What then of such a machine? It may seem impossible that in the time of Nebuchadnezzar such inventions as heavier-than-air flying machines were actually in use, able to carry passengers and drop bombs. Nevertheless, there are many indicators that in prehistoric days, long before the flood, the science of flight was known and practiced. Geoffrey of Monmouth describes the Trojan king Blodud as a magician who fashioned wings and fell upon the temple of Apollo in Trinoventum and was dashed into many pieces. 86. 86 Geoffrey of Monmouth, History of the Kings of Britain, I. 16. The earliest known attempt at flight was that of Daedalus, who invented wings which enabled him and his son Icarus to escape from King Minos in Crete. Daedalus, who designed the labyrinth at Knossos, was far famed as an inventor of many things, including the saw, the potter's wheel, the turning lathe and the awl. What sort of wings he invented we know not, but in these modern days, when gliding without an engine is the pastime of many, who could declare that he did not achieve such success? There is warranty of his successful flight, for the apparatus he used was preserved in a special temple in Euboea where he landed. His son Icarus, less skillful, had earlier fallen into the sea, which legend also was preserved traditionally, for it was off the route and was named the Icarian Sea after him and lends probability to the story. This primitive effort took place many years before the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Records of flight do not halt with Daedalus, and it is noteworthy that almost invariably they are connected with the Hyperboreans in the far north. There is the legend that the Thessalian Cerambus escaped from those parts in the Deucalion deluge with wings supplied by nymphs, a word which had more than one significance and was sometimes used of sorceresses and druidesses. Whether or not the Gorgon Medusa could be described as a nymph, she and her sisters, experts in all forms of magic, were famed as media whereby Bellerophon accomplished his flying escapades. The Gorgons, daughters of Phorcys, or Orcus, dwelt in the region of Orshu, Orkney Isles and Caithness, at the extreme of Oceanus, and the myth says that the white-winged horse of the fountain, Pegasus, sprang forth from Medusa and struck off her head, and got his names because he originated at the springs, or foundations, of Oceanus, according to the Theogony of Hesiod. The hero Bellerophon captured Pegasus there, rose with him in the air, and slew the chimera with his arrows after a fierce battle in the sky. The chimera, another aerial invention, had as its forepart a lion, its middle a goat, the hinder part a dragon, and it breathed fire. It had wrought great havoc in Lycia and the surrounding countries, which suggests events outside the realms of pure fancy, while its description recalls the cherubim of Ezekiel's machine. As for Bellerophon, he subsequently attempted too ambitious a flight, was thrown from Pegasus, became crippled and blind, and was said in consequence to be hated by the gods. Is it a coincidence that long ago the ancient Britons designed great white Pegasus horses in chalk or stone, placed high upon the hillsides as guides to travellers from northern Scotland to southern England? Most have vanished, but a few have been maintained by local superstition or custom through the ages, as in the Vale of the White Horse and elsewhere. They were not designed for mere pedestrians, or even charioteers. Pegasus appears to have been adopted as the emblem of aerial flight, and the suggestion may be that Bellerophon was actually a pioneer in flight in a machine, the white horse being emblematic of speed, and accorded wings to indicate flying. Pegasus was later adopted as a zodiacal figure and appears on the earliest Cassi or Macedonian coins. There are legends of Hyperboreans like Boreas, king of Thrace, who transported by air the Attic maiden Oreithyia to the garden of Phoebus Apollo in the Hesperides. There she became the mother of Calais and Zets, possessors of the gift of flight, who conducted punitive operations from the air. There is also the tradition of Abares, the Hyperborean priest of Phoebus, who received from the god the arrow with which he had slain the Cyclops and who flew with it to Delos and Athens. Eratosthenes says that the god concealed the fatal missile among the Hyperboreans beyond Teraphon, winged. Dr. Skene possibly places his finger on one such spot at Baghead, the ancient settlement with its promontory, in the Vaco-Magi country, on the south side of the Moray Firth, not far from Elgin. He says it was named Teraton Stratopedon, the winged camp, Aela de Castra, .87. This word winged is peculiar to the north. Watmore suggests that the Gaelic word for the Isle of Skye, Sgianathach, means winged. He also refers to the winged temple at Callernish, like a. 87 W.F. Skene, Celtic Scotland, I, p. 75. Standing before a circle tilted upright, is the shaft or pole, the wings plane designed in stone, which consists of 48 upright stones, with a sunken chamber of circular form in the center. He remarks on this, it is impossible not to see in the temple the emblem of Asur, in which the god, encircled at the waist by a ring, or sometimes being the arms or cross shaft. 88 In the British Museum a stone plaque is to be seen in the Assyrian room, where the god is hovering over a city, arrow in hand, in just such a device. Where do these traces take us? Were they merely fanciful designs and myths? Had they no practical significance? Gerald Massey, the Egyptologist, throws a light on the subject. In the Kushian legend of creation we are told that the great gods created warriors with the body of a bird, and men with the faces of ravens. 89. The reference to ravens recalls one of the magic possessions of Odin, whose ravens whispered in his ear morning and eve all the news from the entire world which they had collected by flights. The Book of Daniel appears to indicate that one called Gabriel, who appeared suddenly before the prophet on 2 occasions to give him advice and prophecy, was a flying man. There are also indications that the Persians acquired some knowledge of flight by air, but its use was anyhow very limited and secret. More to the point is that, so far as the Antichrist traditions are able to be checked, there are 2 or 3 which can relate to the actual period under consideration. One such, attributed to Jerome, says that the Antichrist king came from Babylon. 90 Another declares that he vanquished the kings of Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia, as was claimed of Nebuchadnezzar, and after wasting everything seated himself in the temple of Jerusalem, called himself God and held sway. 91 Another, almost identical, says he appeared in Jerusalem, sat in the 88 A.W. Watmore, Insulae Britannicae, Resonance B.W. 89 Gerald Massey, Ancient Egypt, Resonance B.W. ed. A helmet with visor would create this effect. 90 W. Buzet, The Antichrist Legend, Resonance B.W. 91 Ibid. Temple, and proclaimed himself God. 92 Both these seem to apply to Nebuchadnezzar, in all ways. In another legend the Antichrist, like a dragon, flies in the skies like an angel fashioning terrors. 93 It is difficult to avoid relating all these to the king of Babylon, but like all such documents they are elusive and framed on the ex post facto method, otherwise as of events which did occur but put in the form of prophecy. In regard to the identification of the prophet Ezekiel's machine, and all its mystification, intentional or through ignorance of the scientific aspect, it can be claimed with confidence that it could only have been an aeroplane with wings, propellers, engine, and fuselage. Not only were such craft possible but they even fit into the period in question, and there is the further consideration that the Chaldeans, who as Kuldees are known to have ruled south as far as York, at least were in fact northern Druids. They were Hyperboreans, the pioneers of civilization and the true inventors of every form of magic including flying. If it be conceded that the machine was able to fly, and resembled a type of aeroplane, we may proceed to the next point of importance. That of course is to identify the mysterious personage who suddenly alighted in the machine by the river and employed Ezekiel to proclaim him the Lord God to the people of Jerusalem. We may abandon any idea that it was a mere vision or any pious fabrication, for it is altogether too detailed in its description, besides the fact that there was a lapse of 13 months between the two related events. There was only one human being to whom it could relate. Obviously it was Nebuchadnezzar himself. He alone, at that time lording it over the world, a tyrant, inclined to violence, could occupy the position described by the prophet. He dictated to him what he had to say and do, that he had to deify him in phrases such as, "Thus saith the Lord God," for had not this erratic monarch in his position as the living Hermes or Gad, been regarded as God? It was not so surprising if he intended to force the Judaeans to accept him on like terms. Looked at in that 92 Ibid. 93 Ibid. Light, his accusation against the king and people as impudent and rebellious falls into its rightful setting. Yet on the face of things there is a difficulty confronting the investigator. If, as suggested earlier, Nebuchadnezzar was theoretically strongly hostile to the Mosaic cult, which Josiah had ordained some 16 or 17 years previously, such fails to explain his attitude towards the groups he exposed to Ezekiel in his anger when in Jerusalem on the occasion of the second flight. He might have raged against the men conspiring in some secret chamber with censer and flames, headed by Jazaniah's son, grandson of Shaphan, a principal in the Josiah coup d'état, and yet, strangely enough, he made Gedaliah governor of Judea when he finally destroyed the city a little later. Why, too, should he have taken exception to the women worshipping at the altar of Tammuz Adonis? Tammuz was a recognized Babylonian deity, the faithful son, or son of deep water of Triton. 94 He was the promised savior who lay dead for 3 days preceding the 25th of March, when he arose from the underworld amid great rejoicing. 95 Unless Nebuchadnezzar had become in the meantime a convert to the Mosaic cult, his attitude was quite illogical. The same applies to his savage treatment of the 25 old men who turned their backs upon the Mosaic altar and worshipped the sun, and were all massacred by his order. The question arises whether he had been converted to the Mosaic cult by Daniel and his friends. It affords an explanation of an otherwise utterly contradictory attitude. It leads to the question whether the great figure set up in the plain of Dura was in fact a prearranged plan between the king and the Jewish astronomers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to overthrow the Chaldean hierarchy. The highest in the land assembled there, the order to fall down and worship the idol, the refusal of the 3 wise men to do. 94 Lewis Spence, Dictionary of Mythology, Resonance BW. 95 R. Brown, J.R., Semitic Influence in Greek Mythology, p. 148. Williamson, The Great Law, pp. 54-66. So, their immediate seizure and casting into the mysterious fiery furnace already prepared, in which they walked about unscathed with an unidentified fourth man, whom circumstances suggest was Daniel, all these point to a prearranged plot. The sequel further indicates this, for immediately after Nebuchadnezzar had released the 4, in the presence of all his princes and governors, he said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, and language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort." Daniel 3, 28-9, whereupon he immediately promoted the 3 who had defied his previous decree to the highest posts in his kingdom. He was making war on the Chaldean priests. It may have been a sudden conversion, but we should recollect the great moral influence that Daniel, his right-hand advisor, exerted over him. Daniel may have instigated the entire plan. The effect on the Chaldeans must have been profound, and it is not surprising that they presently excommunicated Nebuchadnezzar. Such an attitude would cover his violent attitude towards those Judaeans who were guilty of backsliding to pagan gods, his general intolerance and tyranny, and his behavior towards Ezekiel. That he became insane was the indication which caused him to be driven from his throne. He walked into his splendid palace and boasted, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built, by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" 4:30. Insanity takes a form of megalomania, to which many dictators, both royal and upstart, have been subject through the centuries, as history past and present reveals. And just as the king was thus boasting of his greatness, lo and behold, a voice from heaven spoke, and said, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. 4:31, and we are told that from that same hour he was driven forth from men, and ate grass as oxen, his body wet with dew, his hair grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. A voice from heaven. Yet it must have been expressed through human vocal cords. The obvious explanation is that the edict came from the Magi, his own Magi, who for their protection had found it necessary to excommunicate the all-powerful king of Babylon. Their power, we know, was supreme over all men. They turned against the prophet and messenger of Hermes, doubtless realizing better than other men what lay behind such pretensions. We have in Bel and the Dragon an apocryphal but vivid description of their power, and how, when Cyrus was supreme in the world, master of both Europe and Asia, how the Magi, furious when Daniel destroyed the temple of the dragon, bearded that monarch. They conspired against him saying, the king is become a Jew, and he hath destroyed Bel, he hath slain the dragon. They threatened him to his face, deliver us Daniel, or else we will destroy thee and thy house. And when the king saw that they pressed him sore, being constrained, he delivered Daniel unto them. 22, 23, 28-30, the same thing appears to have happened with Nebuchadnezzar. He had become a Jew in their eyes. He threatened their religion and was a menace to their faith and order. Cyrus, biding his time, suppressed the Chaldean Magi and brought his own Persian Magi in their place, but Nebuchadnezzar was not able to do that. He was excommunicated for 7 years. It was no light punishment, for excommunication automatically barred assistance from any human source whatever, or the culprit was also put under the same ban. The erstwhile proud monarch could not so much as beg a crust of bread. Punishment was remorseless so long as the Magi were all-powerful, as they had been for over 2,000 years. The voice from heaven was doubtless the vox dei or decree of the archmagus or archdruid who pronounced the sentence as from the Most High, whereby the King of Kings was made a wretched outcast, dragging out his pitiful existence unkempt, untended, without so much as a hovel of his own. Shelterless, drenched by rain and storms, existing on grass or roots, or wild herbs, faring no better than a beast of the fields. This terrible punishment, later adopted like other Druidic religious customs, by the Pope of Rome, originated in Britain where the Druids were all-powerful. Ralston gives a striking example of how such a ban utterly ruined the great city of Tara, in Ireland, so famed in legend as a city of wealth, with palaces, marble halls, harpists, and song. Its king refused to surrender a priest accused of murder, whereupon the archdruid solemnly pronounced his curse on Tara and the edict of excommunication on all who continued to dwell there. So vast was his power that the entire population deserted the original capital of the Dodainon, which fell into absolute ruin and oblivion, so that in due course its very existence was forgotten, although the hill of Tara still stands, in County Meath. 96. The Druid hierarchy in Britain exercised a similar complete dictatorship over the minds and bodies of all men. It was the only real sovereign power over Celtica and was realized over the British Isles and a large part of Gaul. Dion Chrysostom said of the Druids that kings were but ministers of their will, and he should have known, because he was Bishop of Antioch in the 4th century. 97 They exercised supreme power over secular and ecclesiastical affairs, says Reed, and many of their methods were copied and employed by the early popes. The Druidic Holy Synod awarded a red hat to their chief men, like the later cardinals of Rome. The greatest men, warriors, and nobles, kissed the toe of the archdruid, as the Romans did that of their Pontifex Maximus, a custom adopted later by the popes, and most especially they used the druidic power of excommunication, depriving the victim of food, shelter, raiment, or any human connection with the world. 98. This pronounced form of religious tyranny exercised a dire influence on Britain at a later period, for the power of the Chaldean. 96 W. T. Ralston, Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race, Resonance BW. 97 St. John Chrysostom, Orations, XLIX. 98 WW Reed, Veil of Isis, Resonance BW. Or Druid Magi was overwhelming, as proved in a variety of ways, and lasted in some parts until well after the Christian era. That the Magi or hierarchy excommunicated Nebuchadnezzar is entirely in consonance with the trend of world history in both surroundings and atmosphere. Such action would have been completely alien to the Persian Gulf. The Magi or Druids, as we know, devised magic and taught it to certain of their craft in various degrees. It explains why, according to an early Irish record, how Queen Medb Connaught sent the three daughters of the wizard Caladan to Alba and Babylon to be taught magic. 99 Alba, Albania, or Albion was the Scottish region from Perthshire to the Solway Firth where the Trojan invaders first settled. The site of Babylon, namely York, fits in with this Irish tradition, but Babylon, at the farther end of the Persian Gulf, is highly improbable. For 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar was excommunicated thus by the Druid hierarchy, and then he repented. He acknowledged his error of turning to another deity than the Chaldean Bel. Shorn of his former powers, he was permitted to use the purple once again, but died shortly afterwards. After Cyrus had captured Babylon, Bel and other idols remained supreme until he encouraged Daniel to overthrow them. That the Magi could have dethroned and excommunicated so powerful a monarch as Nebuchadnezzar is proof positive of their overwhelming power and influence, as Chrysostom describes, for he was no weak monarch, and in his day made Babylon supreme in the world. What was his world? Megasthenes says that he became master of Egypt, reduced Tyre, laid waste a large part of Libya and penetrated into Iberia. In my reconstruction of ancient geography, Egypt originally included Wales, Somerset, Wiltshire, Gloucester, as far as Cirencester, her frontier in the east. Her power also extended into southwest Scotland, including the Hebrides and a great part of Ireland, Libya being one early classic name for Ireland, which had nothing to do with Africa. 100 Tyre lay in Dorset. Applied thus to those regions, it. 99 Anon, Book of the Dun Cow, Libhar Nahudra. 100 cf. Diodorus Siculus, we have treated of the ocean that washes Libya, and of the signified that the king of Babylon subdued the west of England and conquered at least a part of Ireland, while Iberia was the Cimmerian land of the Hebrews and had nothing to do with Spain. Islands therein. Our emphasis. Ireland is interesting in this connection. A peep into O'Grady's account of prehistoric Ireland with reference to the Egyptians may not be amiss. They used chariots on a large scale and called them curras, carpenta and asidi. The latter name was also used in Britain. They were armed with swords and spears, also with axes and spearheads of stone as discovered in every corner of the island. In 1739, it is worth noting, an ancient hollow iron pillar was excavated in the town of Dundalk, buried deep, a form of ancient ordnance supposed to have been left there by fugitive Scots in the year 1318 after the defeat of Bruce, but cannon was first employed in modern times only in 1338.101. O'Grady's account of the early period relates to Phineas Farsa, an ancient king of Scythia, who abandoned his dominions and travelled southwards to the plain of Shinar, namely to Babylon. Before leaving Scythia he left his elder son, Eni-Nial, as regent, and took the younger Nial, Nial, with him. At Shinar he sent out 72 men to learn all the known tongues of the world, and then he founded a university in Ireland of which Nial was the head. He appointed to one of the 3 chief professorships Gadel, son of Ethori, one of the 3 great divinities when the Milesians, who ruled Ireland into the historical period, invaded Ireland. The fame of Nial grew, and Pharaoh Sirigris, a name unknown to history as such, but which presumably referred to Sesostris, invited him to Egypt to instruct the youth of his own country. He conferred upon him the lands of Capacirunt, and also his beautiful daughter Skada in marriage. Their son was Gadel Glass. 102. In Nial's time some Hebrews, fleeing from the bondage of Pharaoh, pitched their camp in the area of Capacirunt, in County Cork. Nial. 101 S. O'Grady, History of Ireland, p. 218. 102 S. O'Grady, History of Ireland p. 159. Capacirunt is Cape Siren or Cape Clear. Saint Cyran founded an ecclesiastical community on an island off Cape Clear still called Cyran's Strand. Continues the account, was a contemporary of Moses, and visited Aaron in his camp. Moses cured him of a snake bite in the neck which showed a green scar. Hence he was called Glass, green. Sru, son of Esru, son of Gadol Glass, presided over the Hebrew settlement of Capacirunt, which displeased Pharaoh, and they were driven out. Sru led his people away in 26 ships and landed in Crete, Shetland Orkney, where he died. 103 The next king, Heber Scott, led the Gadolians back to Scythia, having sailed through the Hellespont, Pontic Sea, Pontus, Baltic, and up the river Tanas, Tana River and ford, Lapland, leading to North Cape. After many vicissitudes, their descendants set sail in 3 ships westwards, but were assailed by violent storms. Caesar, a druid and prophet, foretold that they would settle nowhere until they reached an island in the western main. In the reign of Brada, son of Diga, they sailed from Gothland to Spain. 104 There Briogan or Brogan, son of Brada, founded Tor Brogan. He had 10 sons who took part in the Milesian invasion of Ireland. Ith, son of Briogan, saw Ireland through a telescope. He found there the Tuatha De Danann, and at Alanaid, disputing certain treasures of an ancestor, was killed in a fight. 105 The Milesians set out under Heber and Hiriman, sons of Milsus, grandsons of Brioan, in 30 ships, and marched to Tara. It was decreed that they must give notice of invasion, go 9 waves distance from the land, when the island vanished in smoke. Other magical events followed, including a great storm. Heber landed in the Kenmare River. Finally the Milesians defeated the Dedannan, despite their enchantments, at Tailteen, west of the village of Telltown, County Meath, one of the ancient burial places in Ireland. 106. Such is this curious relic of antiquity. Although Egypt and Pharaoh are mentioned, with the implication that Egypt held considerable sway over Ireland in prehistoric days, the events, including Moses, Aaron, and the Pharaoh of the Exodus, relate to the Baltic, Scythia or 103 Ibid. 104 Ibid, pp 160-3. 105 Ibid, p 167. 106 Ibid, pp 169-72. Sweden, Lapland, Great Britain, and possibly Spain, probably Iberia in the original script. They reveal no connection whatever with the regions of the Mediterranean. The same criticism applies to Nebuchadnezzar's conquests. Strabo states that he went to the Pillars of Hercules, marched through Iberia into Thrace and Pontus, as also is confirmed by Eusebius. He probably did march to the Pillar region of the Western Hebrides if he landed in Libya, Giant's Causeway, as Megasthenes says, and as mentioned Iberia was part of Samaria, while Thrace embraced all northern Scotland. In other words, it might be alleged, the king of Babylon made himself practically master of the British Isles, but owing to the hopeless confusion in regard to ancient geography, he is presumed to have led his army all the way from the Persian Gulf overland to Gibraltar, supposed site of the Pillars, a distance exceeding 5,000 miles, and then back again, through many wild and uncivilized lands, an impossible feat for any army, unless supplied with immense transport and a commissariat. Apart from these countries having no possible attraction to Nebuchadnezzar, the absurdity of such claims is at once apparent. On the evidence shown here, King Nebuchadnezzar and his city of Babylon had nothing whatsoever to do with the regions of the Orient. They indicate that he was a prince of Chaldean, Caledonian, origin, who claimed to be the Chaldean Hermes, the deified intermediary between the gods and mankind. He reigned over the Senans or Syrians in eastern Britain with his capital where stands York today. He dominated all Britain and seemingly Ireland, and overthrew the Judaeans on his north where Edinburgh occupies the site of the original Jerusalem. Despite his great power, he was excommunicated by the Druids in accordance with their overwhelming dominance, for reasons never given, but which might be divined. The downfall and fate of this powerful monarch, whereby he fell from the greatest heights to the lowest depths, is in accordance with the recorded power of the Druids through the ages, which declared that kings were but ministers of their will, and Nebuchadnezzar defied them by supporting the Jews and the Mosaic cult. Milton must have possessed evidence unknown to us when he evidently refers to him who reigned 44 years and overthrew the Samothis, or Druids, though he only touches on the fringe of the dramatic story, for in the sequel they overthrew him. More remains to be said yet about the former Chaldean capital, Babylon, which, as York, actually remained Chaldean late into Christianity. The mystery of Strato's tower needs elucidation, for we know of no one in ancient history named Strato, unless it were the family or personal name of Nebuchadnezzar, a title, Nebuchadnezzar, the prophet or advocate of Gad or God. Chapter 5. The Eclipse of Babylon. Give authors their due, as you give time his due. Which is to discover truth. Francis Bacon. 26 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon fell to Cyrus of Persia. Cyrus, a far-sighted and calculating conqueror, laid plans to capture the city many years before he made his invasion. He carefully selected all likely persons who might betray it to him. His earlier campaigns against the Armenians, Cappadocians, and Phrygians leading to the overthrow of King Croesus in Lydia, having been effectively a preparation for the attempt on Babylon, at that time, by far the most powerful, populous, and wealthy city in the world. Babylon alone subsequently yielded to the Persian tyrants 1/2 of their total revenue, a prize well worth the winning. For years Cyrus loudly proclaimed liberty to all slaves, professing, as said Sir Alexander Keith, a noble disinterestedness and a boundless generosity, and finally when he had prepared and gathered them together, Babylon was taken, though by artifice more than power. 107 This artifice relied mainly on treachery from within. Cyrus, undoubtedly one of the most outstanding figures in classic history, had a fascinating personality, a great charm of manner, a reasoning Socratic-like genius in his logic, and was also a great showman. When he made his first formal state procession from the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, he personally supervised the details for grandeur and prestige, as Xenophon puts it, for the magic of the procession seems to me to have been one of those arts that made his government not to be despised. 108 Leading Persians wore rich. 107 Sir A. Keith, The Truth of the Christian Religion, p. 283. 108 Xenophon, Cyropedia, 8, 3, 1. Median robes, and Cyrus adorned himself in a long purple robe, a wig upon his head, his cheeks and eyes rouged and painted, and wearing high-heeled Median shoes. All very oriental and impressive. When the palace gates were thrown open for the triumphal procession of victory in Babylon, firstly the sacrificial bulls and horses made their appearance, followed by a chariot sacred to Bel, drawn by white horses with golden yokes on their necks, and crowned with leaves of laurel or bay. This was followed by a second, similar chariot, and then a third, its horses adorned with scarlet coverings, and behind it men carrying the sacred fire upon a large altar. Finally, in great dignity, Cyrus himself appeared in his chariot, with the tiara upon his head, a vest of purple half mixed with white, loose scarlet trousers, and above these a long purple robe. 109. This splendid figure, with all the glamour attached to so victorious a monarch who could capture Great Babylon without disturbing a brick or a stone, must necessarily have impressed the population as they watched the pomp and ceremony, embellished further by vast numbers of well-trained and well-armed soldiers, as was his object. Xenophon says that all the people, struck by the glory of Cyrus standing in solitary splendor in his chariot, exceedingly tall and handsome, paid unto him adoration which hitherto no Persian had ever received from his own nation. In short, he captured them mentally and morally as well as by arms, and added to his prestige by according public audiences. Moreover, he took no spoils from the city, and left the walls standing. He did not remain long in Babylon, preferring his own capital and Media, but left satraps behind as local rulers until his uncle, Cyaxares, the Darius of the Book of Daniel, went there in his stead. Then, having sown the seed, he effected a revolutionary change in the religious character of the Chaldean Magi, replacing them with his own from Media and Persia. The two apocryphal books, Bel and the Dragon and Baruch, mainly the first, indicate 109 Xenophon, Sirapedia, 3:13. That Cyrus played a particularly astute hand against the Chaldean Magi. He produced Daniel as prophesied, an important figure, although he had evidently been cast aside after the downfall of Nebuchadnezzar. We learn that originally Nebuchadnezzar had ordered the selection of a few young nobles of the king's seed, and of the princes, Daniel 1:3, to be brought out of Jerusalem in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, who had to be well-favored, skillful in wisdom, and understanding science, meaning astronomy and also astrology, in which the Chaldeans were supreme, like the Druids, for they were, as we have seen, one and the same. They dwelt in the royal palace, and with Daniel there were the three named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When Nebuchadnezzar, in his 2nd year, had an ill dream and his wise men could not interpret it without being told what it was, he became intolerant and furious and issued a sweeping decree that all the Magi were to be slain, including Daniel and his 3 friends. Daniel devised a scheme, after consultation with the 3, and then told the officer deputed to slay them that he could interpret the dream. Taken before the king, he proceeded to reel off the account of the great image of gold, silver, brass, iron, and with feet of clay, which he interpreted. The sequel was characteristic of this impressionable monarch. He fell on his face and worshipped Daniel, ordered an oblation and sweet favors to be given to him, and said, "Of a truth your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets." Daniel 2:47, he gave him many gifts, appointed him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and made him chief of his wise men. His 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were also given important posts and yet, later, thrown into the fiery furnace. 2:49. Daniel, for his part, sat in the gate of the king, and became his chief adviser and confidant, with enormous significance. In all this we are concerned with the facts given us, not with fancies. At the same time, the doubt may arise whether Nebuchadnezzar was able to recall his dream or whether Daniel's confidence enabled him to fabricate a plausible version with its ready interpretation. Daniel may well have been able to exert the power of hypnotism, a very ancient art, and such would explain the subsequent conduct of the king in his eccentric attitude towards the Jews. At any rate, Daniel remained all-powerful until Nebuchadnezzar's excommunication, when we hear no more of him until Belshazzar's feast some 34 years later. When the sinister hand was descried writing in the wall the fatal words, "Many, many, tekel upharsin," which none could interpret, the king's mother thought of Daniel. "There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the gods," she said, "whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers." 5:11. Daniel at once interpreted the writing, while Cyrus and his army were making their entry, and Belshazzar commanded that he be clothed in scarlet, with a chain of gold, and be the 3rd ruler of the kingdom. After the easy victory of Cyrus, Darius, Cyaxares, placed 3 presidents over 120 princes, Daniel being made first president by the Persians. The story of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den differs in the book of Daniel and the apocryphal Bel and the Dragon, in the one, Darius being mentioned, and in the other, Cyrus, but the upshot was the same. The Chaldeans were overthrown, and the decree was issued that the God of Daniel was the living God, which was sent unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth. 6:25-6, it denoted the complete triumph of Daniel's policy, although it did not make the Babylonians adopt the cult of Moses. It all points, however, to the fact that Daniel was a powerful ally of the Persians, like the underground movement in our modern wars, the reward being that the first step taken by Cyrus was to restore the Jews to their city of Jerusalem. In short, Babylon fell through the presence of the hidden enemy in its midst. Without mentioning names, it points a moral to certain modern powers who are too tolerant of strangers. History too, as has often been remarked, has a strange way of repeating itself. Cyrus, on his way back to Persia, visited his jealous uncle in Media, for whom he had reserved palaces in Babylon. Cyaxares, a proud monarch whose country, Media, had somewhat despised the Persians as a barbarian people, gave him his daughter in marriage, with a crown of gold, bracelets, a collar, and a Median robe of great magnificence. The princess herself placed the crown on Cyrus' head. Moreover, Cyrus received all Media as her dowry. 110. In Cyrus' company, be it mentioned, was Daniel, who attended him to Susa. I rose up and did the king's business, he says. In that very same year Cyrus allowed the Jews their freedom, and hence Zerubbabel went up from Babylon to Jerusalem with the liberated Jews and large numbers of converts. Darius was also friendly to the Jews. His predecessor, Cambyses, appealed to by many satraps and governors, had forbidden Zerubbabel to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. The governors in Syria, Phoenicia, Ammon, Moab 111, and Samaria had all signed an epistle sent to him in Persia, protesting that the Jews were building the rebellious and wicked city, and setting up its walls and raising up the temple. Know, therefore, that when these things are finished, they will not be willing to pay tribute, nor will they submit to thy commands, but will resist kings. Accordingly the work was stopped for 9 years until the second year of Darius. 112 He then permitted them to go ahead immediately. 110 Xenophon, Sirapediah, 5, 17. 111 Ed note, in the Hebrew Bible, Chemosh, destroyer, subduer, fish god, was the god of the Moabites, number 21-29, J 48:7, 13, 46, and, according to Judges 11:24, seems to have been the national deity of the Ammonites as well. The Hebrew word rendered serpent in Genesis 3:1 is nakash, a shining one. Hence, in Chaldee it means brass or copper, because of its shining. In the same way seraph, in Isaiah 6:2, 6, means burning one, and the serpents in Numbers 21 were called seraphim, or seraphs. The Lord told Moses, make thee a seraph, Numbers 21:8, and Moses made a nakash of brass, verse 9. Seraph is used of a serpent, and also of a celestial being, burning one. Nakash can be understood similarly. The nakash, or serpent, who beguiled Eve, 2 Corinthians 11:3, is spoken of as an angel of light in verse 14. The description of Satan as the king of Tyre and a cherub, Ezekiel 28:11-19, is a different being from the prince of Tyre, in verses 1-10, who is human. 112 Josephus, Antiquities, 11, 2, 1. Darius' policy had been conciliatory rather than savage towards the Babylonians. He lowered their city walls to a height of 50 feet, but he did not rob them of their sacred treasures, which could not be said of his successor, Xerxes. This ambitious and haughty prince determined to overthrow the independent Greek states and make them subservient to his will. Darius had paved the way before him, for he had held both Thrace and Macedonia in thraldom as tributaries to the power of Persia. As Xerxes' invasion of Babylon followed immediately after his failure to overthrow the Greek cities, it can be recognized how necessary it is to revise our basis of ancient geography for their true relationship towards one another. Xerxes' invasion of Greece. When Xerxes set out to invade Greece, after great preparations, all geographically described by Herodotus, his enormous army crossed the Hellespont, North Sea, and landed in Thrace, Caledonia. His first rendezvous of importance was at Doriscus, a town on the sea with a protected bay near the well-known promontory, Cerium. The Persian king marched overland, partly along the coast, and the fleet, when it arrived there, beached their ships on the sands of this adjoining bay. Among other features of this place was a fort or castle built by Darius, and the river Hebrus, swift-flowing, poured into the bay. 113 It lay opposite the island of Thasos, the Holy Island, otherwise Samothrace, the former seat of the arch-hierarch, or, as I have claimed, Ur of the Chaldees. In the poetic description of Homer, the god Poseidon watched the battle between the Greeks and Trojans from a Samothracian height. Wandering he viewed the battle where he sat. Aloft on wooded Samos' topmost peak. Samos of Thrace, whence Ida's heights he saw. And Priam's city and the ships of Greece 114. 113 Herodotus 7, 59. 114 Homer, Iliad, Trans Derby, 13, 12-13. On the mainland by Doriscus stood two Samothracian forts named Sale and Zone, and beyond this region, adjoining the land of the Sicanies, nearest to Samothrace itself was another coastal headland named Strium. 115. I would identify the area through which Xerxes marched first as Caithness, where, facing Orkney, stands the town of Thiso, the port for Stromness or Kirkwall, Orkney, so the wooded height, Samos' topmost peak, was accordingly Ward Hill of Hoy, the commanding height of the Orkneys overlooking Caithness opposite. It towers 1,565 feet on the island of Hoy, the high, meaning the holy or sacred height, from whose topmost peak a splendid vista of the North Sea may be obtained, thus lending point to Homer's poetic license of distance. On the mainland of Orkney, by Stromness and Stenness, 4 miles around, are the vestiges of former main roads, crisscrossing, evidence of prehistoric habitation on a considerable scale, covering several miles on both banks of Lochs Harai and Stenness. Today there are but sparse signs of human occupation beyond a few farms, fishermen's dwellings, and the odd private residence, dotted around here and there. Stromness, the nose of Stroma, takes us to the little island of Stroma, which now lies about 2 miles off the coast of Caithness, in the Pentland Firth, between the two great promontories Dunnet Head and Dunsinspy Head, the former answering to the site of Cerium Point, the most northerly headland along this rocky shore. It would seem that in the time of Xerxes the present island of Stroma was Strium on the mainland, but here the great Atlantic waves have invaded the shore and eaten their way in slowly but unceasingly. Stroma lies within the 10-fathom line, and generally that line may be taken to indicate the former coastline. 115 Herodotus, 7, 59, 107. Herodotus uses a very curious description of the Sicanies, whose region, he says, was formerly called Gaul-Aica, now it bears the name of Bryantica. There is no such classic name as Bryantica, but Gaul-Aica, or Galatia, North Scotland, was called Britannica, cf. Pretonis, and I suggest the name intended was in fact Britannica or Britannia, and that Bryantica was probably a copyist's error. Claudius, when he claimed to have acquired the Orcades, gave his son the surname of Britannicus in consequence. Thiso answers to the situation of Doriscus as described so fully by Herodotus, only the place names have changed owing to their occupation for so long by Norsemen and Scythians, who probably gave Thiso its name after their war god Thor, or Dor. It has a strong stream, the Thiso River, which empties into Thiso Bay, but Castletown, a small busy town 5 miles east of Thiso, answers better to the site of Doriscus. The ancient castle may originally have been that erected by Darius. Many prehistoric ruins of castles exist in this region. The remarkable characteristic of this part of Caithness and, as already stressed, of Stromness and Orkney, is the presence of a series of former almost chessboard-like straight and cross roads, indications of a once considerable population in these now deserted parts. From Thiso to Castletown and from the latter for a further 2 miles at least southwards along the direct road to Wick on the east coast, are indications of a great number of main roads with crossroads diverging towards the shores and centered around Castletown. Furthermore, the route between that town and Wick, a distance of almost 21 miles, shows indications of former habitations in the same way, though more spread about, as though a suburb of a large, ghostly city. Wick, the county town, presents a similar indication of a series of crossroads stretching for over 8 miles northwards along the coast, and Wick itself extending some 2 miles inland. Again, in the northeast coastal area, from the small town of Dunnet to St. John's Point, are all the indications of another town of size. All this region, be it added, is studded with pyx houses or brocks. There are literally dozens in this part of the world, all erected as both fortress and dwelling. They may represent what Herodotus describes as Sumerian castles. The Pictish Broch or tower at Mousa, in the Shetlands, about 100 feet high, shaped like a dice cup and containing apartments reached by a circular stair which ran to the top, and the Broch at Baa in the Orkneys, 40 feet in diameter and with walls 12 feet thick at the foundations, are characteristic of many. Some others are underground pyx houses, cone-shaped, as near Kirkwall. Orkney, which rise as green mounds above the surface, some built of uncemented stone and apparently used as places of refuge. The strange thing is that such have not been traced outside Britain, and their ghostly presence further denotes a considerable population in the prehistoric age, but they were depopulated by the Great Catastrophe and subsequent climatic changes. Caithness also possesses the greatest number of cromlechs, or stone altars, in Britain, these belonging to the same age as the refuge caves or weems. In most situations, says Wise, who made a close study of these dwellings, little stone houses were built underground. Middens show that they were inhabited in the Bronze Age. 116 The name of Caithness may give some idea of their owners or founders. Professor Waddell, in his search for the origins of Aryan civilization, claims that Caithness and Sutherland were named Caitiff, land of the cat, the lion breed, and as Catti, or Catti, or Cassie, whose chief was called Diuk Cat, the Duke or Dux of the tribe, a title formerly borne by Earls and Dukes of Sutherland. He traces their origin to the Shetlands and thinks their capital was originally at Lunesting, on the northeast of the Shetland mainland, with a headland named Caithness. Caithness, he says, was derived from Cata or Cattiness, nose of the cat, the Kattegat, entrance to the Baltic, was the gate of the cat. 117. Waddell goes farther than this to trace their origins. They were, according to his researches, the old ruling race of Syrophoenicia, known in the Old Testament as Hittites or Hittites, and were the Ari or Arya, the noble ones, the men of renown, the true Aryans. They were tall, fair-complexioned, blue-eyed, wore Phrygian caps and boots with turned-up toes, and were related to the Goths. 118 Goths or Geti they might be, properly Scythians, the race of Magog, according to the early Scandinavian writer Johann Magnus, who says that King Sven ruled over the Goder in Sweden shortly before the flood. Descended from the original Thracian or 116 Thomas A. Wise, Paganism in Caledonia, p. 10. 117 Waddell. 118 Ibid, p. 6. Titan stock, they called themselves Goth, cfr word God, like the Chaldeans, the Kelida, children of God, whose hierarch was the Gad or God, to whom Moses referred in the highest terms. And he provided the first part for himself, because there, in the portion of the lawgiver, was he seated, and he came with the heads of the people, he executed the justice of the Lord, and his judgments with Israel. 119. The Gad executed his judgments from Ur of the Chaldees, otherwise Samos of Thrace, Orkney. From these self-same parts originated the tribe known in the scriptures as Hate or Hittites, who became the Macedonians. Northern Scotland, nowadays relatively unproductive due to its extensive wild mountain ranges and the deterioration in climate, offers little comparison with the prehistoric ages. Caithness possesses nearly 439,000 acres, of which only 1/4 are productive. Most of the soil is bare, moorland or forest. A number of cattle and hardy sheep are reared in spite of the chilly climate and insufficient sunshine, but contrast with this what it must have been in a pristine age when these bare spaces were fruitful, where today ghostly indications of former streets, lanes, squares, and the surviving dwellings intimate an age of activity and importance when Theseus' parts might well have been described as the very hub of the universe. In Xerxes' time its power had greatly waned, although we know from Herodotus and Thucydides that Thrace had formerly many important cities. Thrace declined after the destruction of Samothrace, and Macedonia, south of the Moray Firth, in due time became the paramount world power, after the overthrow of Persia. The true site of Thermopylae. To an extent, we may trace the maneuvers of Xerxes in this expedition to overthrow Athens, which took place shortly before the 119 Deuteronomy 33:21. The pronunciation of Gad was probably with a long A as in guard. The English tongue may have originated in these parts, for the name Thrace may be derived from the race. Achaean destruction of Babylon. As he marched his vast conscript army westward through Thrace and Macedonia, his fleet sailed round the coast to seek battle with the Greeks, and eventually it reached the western highlands and Hebrides. Having passed through the Aegean Sea, probably so named after the monster Aegeos, hence the Isle of Ike, the fleet proceeded to the Strait of Euripus, Sound of Mole, situated between Euboea, Mole, and the Magnesian coast of Thessaly, Morvan. Hearing that the Athenian ships were cruising round the mouth of the Peneus, Loch Linhey and the Firth of Lorne, 120, the Persians sent a strong squadron round Euboea to force them into the Euripus, where the main Persian fleet was waiting to entrap them. This strategy was defeated by a severe gale in that stormy sea, which drove the Persian ships off Euboea upon the reefs, in which the entire squadron was wrecked about the hollows of Euboea. 121 The hollows agree with the notoriously dangerous Torin rocks off the southern shore of Mole. The Athenians advanced nevertheless against the Persian fleet, being superior sailors and knowing their home waters, but after indecisive actions they retreated southward to Salamis, and the Persians sailed up the Peneus River, Loch Linhey, anchored near Thermopylae, Pass of Glencoe, and were permitted by Xerxes to view the scene of the epic fight where Leonidas and his army had died to a man defending the pass. Here is one more sidelight on this war. When Xerxes was yet in Macedonia, in the region of Inverness, from whence he could espy the Olympus Mountains, Loch Haber Range, he was taken in a galley to view the scene of the Deucalion deluge, the flood of Noah, and, observing the gorge between Olympus, Ben Nevis, Pelion, Craig Magade, and Ossa, probably Aeonic Beag, 122, he observed. Nothing more is needed than to turn the river upon their lands by an embankment which should fill the gorge and force the stream. 120 The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain, pp 94, 98, 101, 142. 121 Herodotus 8, 15. 122 Ben Nevis, Scotland's highest peak, was the original Mount Olympus. Pelion answers to Craig Magade, 3,700 feet, where the Spey rises and where the rivers divide, some going east like the Spey, and others west like the Spian, as was said of Pelion. Ossa corresponds with Aeonic Beag, 3,646 feet, on the south of the Spian. From its present channel, and lo! All Thessaly except the mountains would at once be laid under water. 123. This is entirely in accordance with the terrain around Ben Nevis, and in descending from Loch's Ness and Lochie, Xerxes would sight the gorge through which runs the river Spian, falling into the Lochie River at Mucomber Falls, surrounded on either side and hemmed in by high mountains, their flanks marked by what are termed parallel roads, actually sea beaches, mentioned earlier, from 1,278 feet above sea level at Glen Glowy visible from Loch Lochie, to various levels of 1,140 feet, 1,059 feet, and 847 feet. Geikie, the eminent geologist, held views similar to those held by Xerxes some 300 years earlier. Geikie was of the opinion that immense glaciers may have held up the waters, but he could not account for their presence. He was unaware that they related to the flood of Deucalion or Noah. The significance of the visit of Xerxes is that he could not have gone secretly in a galley from Macedonia to Thessaly in the present Greece except by the open sea, risking capture or worse, yet he went safely by water to spy out the terrain. The classic map of Thessaly in fact completely fails to meet the circumstances. Mount Olympus is placed at the extreme north of Thessaly, as is correct of Ben Nevis in Argyllshire, the true Thessaly, but Mount Pindus is put in the extreme west, whereas Aristotle states that the deluge occurred west of Pindus. 124 and Thermopylae is given the very south of Thessaly, with the Pindus range to its northwest, over 60 miles distant as the crow flies, whereas these mountains lay to its east. Xerxes obviously saw the traces of the deluge in the parallel roads, for the topography applies completely to the western highlands and in no single respect to the modern Greece. The same contention applies equally to the pass of Thermopylae, for the terrain indicates that it could only relate to the dread pass of 123 Herodotus 7, 130. Also the riddle of prehistoric Britain, pp 89-103, 133-4. 124 Aristotle, Meteorologica, I, 14. Glencoe, and at once explains how the Persian ships could have sailed up the Peneus River, Loch Linhi, to the Gulf of Melis, Loch Leven, whereas in modern Greece it is 70 miles distant from the Gulf of Melis. In western Scotland, the Spian, cf. Peneus, runs rapidly through the great mountain basin of the Loch Haber Range, swelled in times of spate by the waters of dozens of highland burns, swirls through the Mucomber Falls, and then, after uniting its waters with the widening river called the Lochie, both merge into the river Loch Linhi, upper and lower point 125. After coursing through Inverlochie Glen, the stream reaches Loch Leven, formerly Mally, now Kilmally, the church of Mally, answering to the Gulf of Melis, on whose southern shore lies the entrance into the pass of Glencoe. It can therefore be readily understood how and why the Persians, from the western shores, could sail 22 miles or so from the mouth of Loch Linhi to the Gulf of Melis, Loch Leven, to inspect Thermopylae, and how Xerxes, from the other end, could sail down from the direction of Loch Ness to inspect the marks of the Deucalion deluge on the mountain flanks. But not by other means. At the mouth of Thermopylae the Hellenes had erected a fort or wall of loose stones and narrowed down the entrance to fit only 2 men at a time, and, as Herodotus tells us, they were prepared to defend it to a man. Leonidas held the enemy here at bay until a man of Trachis showed the enemy another very rough pass by which means they took the Spartans in the rear. Examination of the gorge of Glencoe from the southern end of Loch Leven confirms the fact that a few resolute men could hold the pass there against a multitude, as was known to the hero Leonidas and his followers. This other pass, called Aenopia by Herodotus, was rough climbing, steep, and rarely used. Here the Spartan king had placed 1,000 Phocians, but when these saw masses of Persians clambering up the gully's sides, they became panic-stricken and fled. The Aenopia pass may be sought. 125 By a change of the first letter, Linhi becomes Pinhi, or Peneus, the change in name, Espion and Linhi, being possible due to the known difference in dialect between the Macedonians and the Hellenes. The riddle of prehistoric Britain, p. 94. In the narrow, steep, and rugged defile, much nearer to Kinloch Leven, which if climbed from its eastern side could cut off defenders at the mouth of Glencoe like rats in a trap. Its Gaelic name is Anacoir Uther Pig, and it is also known to many as the Devil's Staircase. Once through the pass of Thermopylae all roads were open to Xerxes, Phocis, Locris, the Peloponnesus, and Athens. One road lay past Doris, a tiny area not over 3½ miles in circumference, which led to Achaea and Locris, Durer, to this day a strip of alluvial land bordering on Loch Linhi. The Achaeans 126, a brave, chivalrous, but sporadic clan, were congregated along the banks of the Peneus in the present Applin and Benderloch region, between Durer and Dunstaffnage Castle. There were the roads open to Delphi and Athens, Dumbarton, at the mercy of the enormous armament brought by the Persian king. But this much must suffice. I have said enough perhaps to convince some at least of my readers that these heroic and important events took place in bonny Scotland, to which country the world owes a debt of freedom it can never repay. Of Xerxes' subsequent march to Delphi, and how he captured Athens, and how the indomitable Athenians held out and fought him grimly until his fleet was routed at Salamis and Xerxes retired, terrified that he be cut off at the Hellespont, leaving his general, Mardonius, to extricate his army out of the mess, is a story often recounted and needs no new pen. I simply prescribe a new geographical outlook on those events, but I shall show elsewhere how and why there are the strongest reasons to believe that the ancient city of Dumbarton, with its rocky acropolis, was the classic Athens 127 up to a period. It is a romance indeed, in which tribal wars and the steady deterioration of climate played their part. It is sufficient to add now that, after his disastrous defeat at Salamis, Xerxes fled from Greece in a mighty haste. He is supposed to have 126 ed. Note, cf. Celtic Eocade, horsemen. Circa 220 BC, at the time of Philopoemen, the Achaeans were regarded as superior horsemen. 127 Appendix C. Crossed the Hellespont again, but even Herodotus is not sure of his movements, though he apparently left hurriedly in a single galley from Abdera in Mygdonia, a part of Macedonia. Abdera lay on the river Nessus or Nestus, and Inverness, on the Ness, may have been built on the site of this once flourishing port on the way to the Hellespont. It was very soon after his ignominious flight from Hellas that Xerxes hastened to Babylon, still smarting under the heavy defeat he had suffered, his purpose being to indemnify himself for his heavy losses, to recover his waning prestige, and partly out of zeal to establish the Zoroastrian or Mosaic faith. By reconstructed topography, such a course to reach Babylon, York, conveniently by sea would have been a simple process. From there he later took a ship to Sardis, which may be placed as in the Saarbrück region of the Rhine. Consider the orthodox idea as taught in the schools. To have led his forces to Babylon via Sardis, taking the accepted sites, would have entailed a journey of almost 600 miles from the alleged Mygdonia in Thrace, via the Hellespont, to Lydia in Asia Minor, and thence onward to Babylon a further 850 miles at least, or a total of over 1,450 miles. It is an incredible acceptance of marches to lead armed forces that distance even if they had the commissariat, and it would have occupied an immense amount of time, whereas Xerxes, without taking a rest, actually entered Babylon with little delay in order to restore his damaged prestige. 128. Arrived in Babylon without dispute, he destroyed the temples with fire and utterly laid low the vast temple of Bel, leaving in its place a huge mass of stone, rubble, and dust. He laid hands on the immense treasure stored therein, including solid golden images valued at over 61,000 gold talents, probably worth over £20 million at the present valuation, and took it away to offset his defeat in Greece. 129. 128 About a century ago Sardis was thus described: the site of the once proud capital of Lydia is now green and flowery, a scene of desolation with the exception of a few mud huts which shelter some Turkish herdsmen. Lawson, Scripture Gazetteer, 2, p. 405. 129 William Whiston, the translator of Josephus, estimated a gold talent at near £650 when he was writing. Ed. Note, Comyns Beaumont was writing in the 1950s. While in Babylon he extended his patronage to the prophet Ezra, who then went to Jerusalem with a big following. Josephus describes Ezra. There was now in Babylon a righteous man, and one that enjoyed a great reputation among the multitude. He was the principal priest among the people, the Jews, and his name was Esdras. He was very skillful in the laws of Moses and was well acquainted with King Xerxes. 130. Xerxes had written to the various governors of Syria instructing them to give Ezra all aid on his return to Jerusalem. Ezra read this to the Jews in Babylon, and sent a copy of it to those beyond Euphrates, including the 10 tribes beyond Euphrates, an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers. 131. It throws a sidelight on past events, for Josephus goes on to say that Ezra had gathered those across the Euphrates not far distant, but as regarded the remainder of the 10 tribes, he told the king that God would preserve them, and did not request horsemen or escort to bring them. They were seemingly settled in the present Romania or thereabouts. 132. The Persian tyrant, having thus sacked Babylon and destroyed the famous temple of Bel with other pagan temples and shrines, went on his way. From this period the city declined further. Her walls had been largely thrown down, she was despoiled of her riches, strength, and resources, and was compelled to pay heavy tribute. So little wonder her former population drifted elsewhere, and we hear no more of Great Babylon until Alexander the Great. 130 Josephus, Antiquities, 11, 5, 1. 131 Ibid, 5, 2. 132 Ezra explains elsewhere about the 10 tribes of Israel, carried away by Shalmaneser, who took them over the waters, but that they went into a farther country where never mankind dwelt. He says, they entered into Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river. Through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same regions called Arsareth. 2 Esdras, 13, 40-45. This is thought to be the Sareth River in Romania, separated from Hungary by the Carpathian Mountains. Shalmaneser carried others away into Assyria, and placed them in Hala and in Eber, by the river of Gozan, Uz, and in the cities of the Medes. 2 Kings, 17:6. Chapter 6.